Today on CityCast DC, it is CityCast's Spy Week, which is presented by the International Spy Museum. This means we are doing a week's worth of episodes about secret agents and covert goings-on right here in DC. We'll kick it off today with a battlefield tour of sorts, the best spy stories in the district's long, secret history. And at the end of the episode, there's a short bonus interview that has nothing to do with espionage. There's been a shakeup in the city government, and we are talking to a reporter who's been covering the fracas. Today is Monday, May 8th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. So Bob Wallace, you literally wrote the book on spy sites and locations in DC. When people think of spies, we think of the Cold War, but it actually dates back to the beginning of this city's status as the national capital. What's your best, most interesting spy story from Washington?
One spy site in Washington that maybe has more espionage activity that we know about that's occurred there than any others, it would be the Mayflower Hotel on Connecticut Avenue.
There are some crazy stories about that in your book. Tell us about it.
Well, the Mayflower, built in 1925, became initially a place where the Japanese naval attaché would throw parties in the 1930s and meet a variety of people whom he cultivated, both for information as well as for potential spies for the Japanese, and that run up to the Second World War. So we see a spy site there in the mid-1930s, and then we go to 1942. The Germans decided to run sabotage operations in the United States, and they sent 2 teams to the United States, but George Dash got cold feet, shall we say. And he checked into the Mayflower Hotel, a room that, Michael, you can check into that very same room at the Mayflower Hotel today. And he called the FBI from there and said, "Hey, look, I'm a German saboteur, and I'd like to talk to you." The FBI in Washington was willing to listen to his story. And based on that, the FBI was able to wrap up the 2 German saboteur teams before they could do any damage. Now we also have a Russian spy story.
Also in the Mayflower. Why didn't they just go to the Motel 6? I mean, at this point, that place is cursed for spies.
Well, the reason Aldrich Ames is in the 1980s is a mid-level CIA officer who has access and is responsible for working Soviet operations at CIA. But Aldrich Ames had some money problems, some other issues, and he decided he was going to volunteer his services. Aldrich Ames went to the Mayflower because it's only a block away from what was then the Soviet embassy. So with no meeting, Aldrich Ames just went over to the Soviet embassy and was able to volunteer. And tragically, for American intelligence and for as many as a dozen of our spies then in Soviet Union, they were subsequently executed by Aldrich Ames' treachery.
Another place people walk by a lot is Lafayette Square, which, given that its prime location right opposite the White House, if I were a spy, I might pick one of the many quieter parks in D.C. But apparently it's got a deep espionage history, too. What are some of the plots that went down there?
Lafayette Square, a fascinating location. I stand in Lafayette Square and I say, I'm right at the epicenter of spying in America. If you look around Lafayette Square, there are at least a half a dozen different places where spy activity occurred. Perhaps the earliest was Dolly Madison, who I say was the first intelligence officer who did aerial surveillance for the United States. When she stood on the roof of the White House during the War of 1812, as she saw the British troops moving into Washington from that high observation point. So Dolly Madison represents a particular type of spy. Abraham Lincoln moved into the White House in 1861. He was obviously a target. A significant operation was launched by a very effective Confederate scout by the name of Thomas Conrad. Thomas Conrad disguised himself as a clergyman, and he hung around Lafayette Square surveilling President Lincoln, who would leave the White House most evenings and go north up the street for 3/4 of a mile where there was a Union hospital, and he visited wounded troops in the American hospital. Conrad's idea was to kidnap President Lincoln, and then having the kidnapped president, that would be something the Confederates could trade for a resolution to the war. Plot was pretty good, except it was foiled when President Lincoln started to travel with some security. That was unexpected by Conrad, and ultimately learned that another of the Confederate spies by the name of Mosby was also thinking about or developing a plot to kidnap Lincoln. And Lincoln's security forces got a tip that Mosby was planning this kidnap plot, so they added security. It foiled two plots, both the Mosby plot and the Conrad plot.
So it's interesting. We think of so many of us idea of cloak and dagger spy stuff is set in the Cold War or World War II, James Bond movies. But this period of the Civil War, speak the same language from the same culture. All they got to do is row across a river. There's no elaborately smuggling someone in so they get the accent right when they're 16 years old. The city must have been an absolute snake pit.
The city had dozens and dozens of spies. Probably we only know about a small fraction of them.
Cold War era defectors sold secrets outside the British Embassy on Mass Ave. Allied operatives met at the Mayflower Hotel in 1925 and again in 2010. And odds are there was a spy on your train this morning. With more than 10,000 spies, DC truly is the capital of spycraft. And if you want to understand their secrets, step into their radio transmitting shoes, or into James Bond's Aston Martin, you need to visit the International Spy Museum. Located just off the National Mall, the Spy Museum features 2 floors of exhibits and artifacts. They've got ciphers, submarines, and the actual ice axe that killed Leon Trotsky. While most DC museums discouraged me from touching the artwork, the Spy Museum gave me an undercover identity and tested my skills as a covert operative in a series of interactive challenges. Book your visit today at spymuseum.org. So, is there a most surprising site where spy stuff went down?
If there is a surprise site, it probably would be the mailbox in Georgetown, where Aldrich Ames would leave a signal for the dead drops that he was filling, or the communications that he would have with his Soviet handlers. This would have been in the late 80s and the early 90s. Just a post office box on 35th in Georgetown. Aldrich Ames primarily used chalk to make a mark on that street corner mailbox. Because of its location, a Soviet intelligence officer could drive just down the street and see whether or not there was a mark on the box to indicate either a dead drop had been filled or one had been emptied. But it's surprising because of the number of intelligence officers and over the decades, the number of spies who have located themselves in Georgetown. Georgetown is just crawling with spies and spy sites.
Well, it's a pleasant neighborhood. I mean, if you're here on a foreign government's nickel, and they're going to put you to whatever house you say is the right, I mean, it's a pretty nice place to live, right?
It's a beautiful place to live. The British certainly made use of those locations during the Second World War. Kim Philby had a house in Georgetown. Roald Dahl, British intelligence officer of the Second World War, who wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, had a residence there. So it's well known. Many of the CIA officers, senior officers, particularly in the late 40s and the early 50s, had homes in Georgetown.
Right, so it was an elite neighborhood at a time when these organizations drew in people from a lot of elite backgrounds.
Yeah, they sure did. And then, probably not surprisingly, because they were living there, well, one thing you can say about spies is that a lot of times, I don't want to use the word lazy, but they will do their operations close to home if possible. So places like the old Georgetown Pharmacy was a location during that time, during the 1950s.
Wait, I have a question for you. You've done all this research. You have walked the streets of Washington to show people sites. Let's say you were a secret agent of some sort and you were trying to set up a place for like a secret rendezvous or something. You know Washington pretty well now. Where would you do it?
I probably wouldn't do it in Washington. But what's interesting in terms of the world of intelligence, one of the things that the Russians, the Soviets, realities that they had to face, and which our officers had to face in Moscow as well, is that there is a circumscribed radius in which we could move. We were allowed to travel, and I think it was 25 miles during the Cold War for the Russians
Right,
here
so the
in
Russians
Washington,
couldn't go beyond Gaithersburg or something.
unless they had explicit permission for an official reason from the U.S. State Department. So you become kind of constrained there, and the constraints usually will lead you to open areas, parks and bridges. Generally, the location where spies like to conduct their operations. And they like parks and bridges, parks because the privacy and the mobility, the ability to move to a lot of different areas in parks to possibly meet somebody or conduct an operation. Bridges because they are very convenient place. Underneath a bridge is a good place to leave a package for a dead drop. And Robert Hansen, the FBI agent who was a spy for the Soviets, used dead drops. Michael Semenko, who was one of the Russian illegals that was arrested in 2010, used bridges in the Washington area, again, to leave his drop or to retrieve a drop. So I think in spy sites, we have 6 or 8 bridges that we have located where spies have conducted their operations.
Do you have a favorite?
No, there's kind of a cool one up in Maryland on one of the lesser routes in Maryland. Looked like a pretty interesting site. It also looked like a nice stream to fish in.
It could give you a good cover.
It is a cover that has been used all over the world by spies.
Bob, thank you for being here.
You are very welcome. Happy to have the conversation, Michael.
We're going to have special spy-related content like this all week long for you. Plus, Spy Museum tips. Via our sponsor, today's hack of the day is how to get there. The museum's address is 700 L'Enfant Plaza Southwest, but it is located on Upper 10th Street. Note that there is a Lower 10th Street where you can access an underground parking garage. If your Uber or Lyft tries to drop you on Lower 10th, ask them to drive up the ramp to drop you in front of the museum. And before you go, we've got one big news update for you today. If you have been listening to CityCast DC for a while, you know that the DC Housing Authority and its director, Brenda Donald, have been under fire for a bunch of different issues. They've been overpaying landlords, they've been failing to adequately maintain public housing units, they've received huge bonuses despite all that. Well, late last week, Brenda Donald resigned. And we've got the Washington Post's Steve Thompson, who's broken a bunch of stories about the agency, here to tell us why. All right, so Steve, Brenda Donald has been facing the heat for months now. Why did she now decide to leave? What was the final straw?
We don't know. It was unclear. She made the announcement, or the agency made the announcement at about 10:15 the other night, p.m. And it's a little unclear. In a LinkedIn post on her LinkedIn account yesterday, I think she just turned 68 last month. And she said that it was her birthday gift to herself to step down.
She was looking for a Steve Thompson free 69th year.
Maybe so.
All right, so they're looking for a new boss. It is a somewhat troubled agency right now. How does her departure affect the ability to get back on track?
Well, it probably depends on who you ask. The mayor has been a staunch supporter of her and has been praised her performance. And if you ask somebody with that point of view, then they're probably sorry to see her go. But they're hoping they can get somebody that could fill her shoes. There are a lot of critics, maybe chief among them are the legal aid advocates who advocate for public housing residents. And I think if you asked any of those, they might say, we just hope they get somebody that can do this job the next time around, because this agency's been in the ditch for a long, long time, and they were hoping that Brenda Donald might fix that. Donald says that she has put the agency back on track, but I think these critics are skeptical of that.
So real quick, what are the agenda items for fixing this agency?
Well, HUD came out with a report last fall that had something like 82 findings of deficiencies. And it said that basically the agency was failing to provide decent, safe, sanitary housing for its residents. And, that was the underlying finding of all of these deficiencies. But there's just a wide range of stuff that they need to fix, from, deteriorating conditions in their public housing properties to how they deal with their vouchers and how they pay for the vouchers and how they pay landlords for them. There's just all sorts of stuff that HUD wants to see them get fixed. And so the to-do list is very long, and the deadline for all that is the end of this month. It doesn't seem reasonable to think that they're going to fix all that stuff by the end of this month, and we'll have to see whether HUD thinks the progress that they've made is sufficient, whether it's at least on track.
Steve, thank you so much for the update.
Thanks for having me.
We will be covering this more in the coming months. Call or text us with your questions. We're at 202-642-2654. And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. Be sure to tune in tomorrow for another Spy Week episode. Did you know that there are an estimated 10,000 spies in the city? That means you probably know one. Tomorrow we've got a former CIA agent to help you spot spies around you. If you enjoyed the show, why not leave the details in your favorite dead drop and subscribe to our morning newsletter? We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.
I did spend a career in the government, so as you can see, I got off on a real long tangent rather than just answering your question.